Hello and welcome to Under the Super Scope, where we take a look at some of the most famous games of all time and try to work out if they still hold up today. And this time we're...
Plumber boy, mustache man, your worst nightmare has arrived.
Today we're...
Pack up your stuff. I got a little surprise for you here. Check it out. What do you think about that?
Today... Alright, today's about Crash. You happy? Jeesh. So a lot of us hold Super Mario 64 as the precedent for 3D game design, and while I think there's certainly a valid reason for that, it's by no means the first 3D platformer. In fact, in Europe, Crash Bandicoot predated Mario 64 by a matter of months. With the PlayStation's rampant popularity, it may even be the case that more consumers were exposed to the Crash trilogy than Mario 64. With there being little standard for 3D design, the two games took very different approaches. Super Mario 64 practically threw the template set by prior games out the window and made a world we were incentivized to explore in full 3D space, whereas Crash was a little less ambitious. What Crash did was look at the pre-existing approach to side-scrollers and simply skewed the perspective. Crash Bandicoot is by all means and purposes a side-scroller from behind the character, and while this certainly didn't have the wow factor of Mario 64, this perspective came with the perks of higher visual fidelity. See, the PlayStation certainly wasn't as powerful as the N64, but with the camera always being at a slight angle, Crash never needs to render everything at once. Mario 64 was left at a disadvantage, as the whole point of that game relies on you being able to see everything, and so Crash came along looking absolutely stunning for its time and having the accessibility of a side-scroller intact. It's a style of 3D design we haven't seen replicated too often, but the Crash games still remain incredibly popular today, especially with the N-Sane trilogy just releasing on a new batch of platforms. So let's take a step back and see if this take on 3D game design actually has some merits, and whether Naughty Dog's classic still holds up. The very first levels in Crash are what I would consider some of the finest and most intelligent displays of game design the game has to show. And from the word go, the game demands you to crash. We get a scripted showcase of Crash's Tasmanian-inspired spin attack, which is of course one of his two primary functions. Crash can jump and Crash can spin. The vast majority of precision side-scrollers don't offer a second input that has a great deal of frames. So with Crash taking a lot of design inputs from what came before, what gives? Well, the fixed behind-the-shoulder camera is, simply put, not good for precision platforming. Crash accommodates wherever it can, but your depth perception a large amount of the time will rarely be as precise as it needs to be, and so the spin attack is a forgiving way around that. Crash's spin lasts approximately 0.3 seconds. It's not a 3-frame punch or something that requires a great deal of precision, and so when I spin into boxes, or more importantly, enemies, I'm given a fairly forgiving window of invulnerability. The spin is the answer to a lot of the game's issues with 3D positioning, and it's a mechanic that's enforced from the word go. If the demonstration there wasn't enough, then this small space full of boxes is your test area. Now, jumping on objects in 3D space has always been a bit of a challenge, and I think many of us would agree that one of the hardest things to do in Mario 64 was simply hit a block without fumbling around. This is possibly why the game doesn't have very many blocks. With the spin, this isn't an issue at all, and it's pretty important how this mechanic is introduced before even the jump. Of course the jump's coming up though. We get around this crab either by spinning into it, jumping on it, or using our 3D space to walk right by it. But right after that, we have no choice but to jump over this gap. And right there, the game has essentially taught us every single element we need to know. Crash is a game where you break boxes, avoid enemies, and jump over gaps. Simple, easy, and now all the levels need to do is reinforce this mentality and get you jumping in different ways. We're given an Aku mask, which we'll find out is a layer of protection if we ever take a hit, and then we simply perfect our jumping mechanic. That is until we reach this wall here. Up until now, we've simply been moving forward, similar to how we'd move to the right in a side-scroller, but this wall requires us to move along the 3D plane. This is an important element of Crash, as well as technically a side-scroller, it's one with a little more depth, and so this risk-free showcase of freeform movement is a brilliant way to reinforce that. And in fact, it leads into one of the most defining and somewhat misleading portions of this level, the split path. Here we're able to keep left and take a leisurely walk to the goal, or try our luck bouncing on all these boxes. So why is this misleading? Well, very few other levels in Crash 1 are like this. We have separate bonus rooms that contain similar challenges, but to be given an optional path, with one being easier but fewer rewards, is something that just doesn't happen very often. It's a shame too, as it's a great way to reward those who want to collect everything, while giving less experienced players a path forward. With all the core mechanics under our hat, the second level opens with a new element that expands upon what we know. This is the TNT box. Now TNT works very similarly to any other box in the game, only it can kill you. You need to jump on it to start a detonation, and if you spin into it, it will just explode. You're given the means to experiment and learn this with an Aku Aku mask being just before the TNT, so you can mess up and not really lose anything. A lot of games have similar approaches, like having small platforms just to protect you on the first run, and then introducing bottomless pits, so this is just kind of its own take on that. With that teaching out of the way though, we begin to see how Crash mixes up each level. Like most platformers, pretty much every single level has some kind of defining trait that sets it apart from the last, and we'll get into that a bit more later, but the second level is home to these spinning wheels that rock left and right. These expand on the emphasis of horizontal movement in addition to vertical progression, which is what Crash is all about, but they also showcase where Crash can falter. Iteration is incredibly important when teaching anything, whether it be game design or just life lessons, but it gets to the point where you iterate too much and that just results in repetition. There are 12 instances of these moving wheels, but only 3 of them change how they work. We have the base moving wheel, 2 wheels moving at the same time, and then finally a gap directly before the moving wheel. That's a fine progression in mechanics, but it all feels very vanilla. And what's worse is this is far from the only example of repetition. There aren't 12 instances of moving wheels, there are in fact 29. Essentially, every level idea is reused again in Crash 1, and rarely is there more than one iterative step. This one simply contains a pillar before the moving wheels, and this is literally how it defines a new level. Let me illustrate what I mean further. The Great Gate, Native Fortress. Upstream, Up the Creek. The Lost City, Sunset Vista. Freaking Road to Nowhere, Freaking the High Road. When boiling it down, Crash 1 has very few ideas and burns through the few it does have rather quickly. Levels occasionally try to have multiple gimmicks, but they falter by not having them built into each other. Sunset Vista has these rotating bridges, these moving pillars, these fireplates, these bats, these enemies that bounce from pillar to pillar and annoyingly push you in the opposite direction, these rotating blocks, and these shuffling pillars. That's a lot of elements, and what's frustrating is none of them really evolve. These bridges are always the exact same, these rotating blocks change orientation once, and the bouncing enemy is just a way to cause a cheap frustration. There's not one element tying this level together, and what we end up with is a sporadic jumble of assets in the vein of a bad Mario Maker level. Let me demonstrate with this level I whipped up. So we start off with this moving platform because why not? And we have to make it through this small gap. If the player doesn't have enough momentum, they'll fall, which I think will be really fun for them. They'll die if they fall regardless, but I put these spikes here anyway, just in case. We then have a spring that we'll never see again, and then I bring the platform back, only this time it's on a rail, and you have to go through a treadmill to get to it. We'll then have some floating blocks, and I put a Cooper on this one for some undisclosed reason. I didn't think fire was good enough on its own as an interceptor, so I put a thwomp above it too. This probably could have worked if I introduced them both separately earlier in the level, but I think players like being stressed with mechanics while standing on a 1 tower long platform. It seems there's nowhere else to go when you're at the top, but being the genius that I am, you have to jump blindly! You then need to bounce off these cannonballs and get to the final moving platform which goes towards the goal. Only there's a wall that blocks your progression. Instead of just jumping over the wall, I thought it'd be fun to put an enemy there to make sure you have to do it all over again if you get hit. This may be an exaggerated concept, but the point still stands. Sunset Vista is a mishmash of concepts, and it's designed in a way that's just challenge after challenge without anything to tie these challenges together. What this level has is a ton of BS, which of course stands for Bandicoot stress. Crash 1 does this marvellous thing where it puts an enemy pretty much at the end of every level. It could be a man-eating plant right by the exit, some shutting doors, a jump you have to make, or just something very trivial that will cause a lot of frustration if you mess it up. Crash 1's a tricky game by all means, but how much of that difficulty is actually challenging and not just another cheap instance of BS? This is BS, and this is certainly BS. To wrap all this BS up, the original PlayStation version of Crash Bandicoot makes you earn the right to save. You can only save if you get all the boxes in a level or make it to the end of a special room. Unlike the N-Sane trilogy, you only get one shot at a special room, otherwise you're not going back there. Considering it's pretty much impossible to get most of the boxes upon your initial playthrough due to boxes being locked away until you finish other levels 100%, this means that you might just not be able to save very often. It's the epitome of BS. For that reason alone, you should really be playing Crash 1 on the N-Sane trilogy. But it's not the only enhancement. Of course the visuals are like a tiny bit better, but due to the longer render distance, the camera usually allows you to see just a little more. It's still not perfect, and there are moments like this where it's very hard to tell exactly where you're going to land due to no visual cue of where Crash is when he's off screen. And then there are moments here where you can't quite tell what's ahead due to obstructive assets. Is there a gap here? I don't think so, and back to the checkpoint. These piranhas in the original game were incredibly annoying, as they had instances where you just couldn't tell where they were, but in the N-Sane trilogy, they're as clear as day. The biggest improvement though is Crash simply feels better. He's very stiff in the original Crash 1, which makes these long vertical segments, of which there are many, utter Bandicoot stress-inducing. Now I just made this other Mario Maker level that I'm really proud of. Ready? Ta-da! Now I know what you're thinking, John, this is the same level that everyone makes when they first start playing Mario Maker. And to that I say, no, it's a one-to-one recreation of Road to Nowhere, silly. Just a bunch of floating blocks with little to no space. Is it challenging? Sure. Is it fun? God, no. Hard games are only worth your time if the challenge that you're tackling is fun. Dark Souls, for instance, is obviously a tough game, but there are very few instances that are actually cheap. No matter what's on screen, there's always something the player can do to turn the tides in their favour. That's not always true of Crash. And no, I'm not calling Crash Dark Souls, stop writing that comment. There was a good example at the start where we were given an Aku Aku mask to trial out the TNT, but as the game goes on, we're expected to learn by losing lives, and that just isn't good design. The flip bridges, you're dead. The red pipes, well the ice ones are fine for some reason, so nope, you're dead. Naughty Dog have no doubt delivered numerous fantastic games over the years, but Crash Bandicoot 1 is simply not one of them to me. The sequels are far more diverse, with more ideas, a better grasp on challenge, and practical instances of iterative design. Crash 1 just does the same thing over and over again and expects different results, which is the definition of insanity, which I guess is kind of fitting, so maybe it's all intentional. Bosses even take this very same approach. Ripperoo just changes where he jumps with no actual increase in challenge. Koala Kong's fight just throws in more TNT to artificially increase the difficulty, and Pinstripe never seems to get harder, you just hit him while he's reloading. What all of these have in common is they're the kind of, I'm going to do my attack pattern and then wait while you hit me kind of bosses. Even the final boss is pretty much exactly like this. The reason I consider this approach to boss fights bad is simply because there's far too much downtime and very little challenge. Let's say you get hit by something during the third phase. Well, now you have to sit through those identical phases again while the exact same thing happens repeatedly. There's no spontaneity. The best kind of boss fights are the ones where they're always open to attack, but they have moments where they're most vulnerable. This way you can decide to play it safe rather than being forced to. Mario is actually a brilliant example of this. I can just try running under Bowser, I can try jumping on the Koopalings, I can deal with the Broodal's hats rather than just waiting for them to throw them all. The series gets a bit better with this in the sequels, but I've always found that Crash bosses are pretty weak. Also, these bats are flying directly through the wall. Are we going to talk about that, or...? In my eyes, Crash 2 is the shining example of how to make a Crash game. There are still some repetitive themes, but levels are designed to be fun rather than just making you hate Bandicoots. And Bandicoots are actually pretty cute. I suggest checking out the Dreamcast Super Magnetic Neo for more diverse and interesting mechanics in a similar style. All in all, I don't think Crash 1 holds up well at all. It's shallow, repetitive, and frankly just cheap. There's a reason not many games adopt this camera today, and that's simply because it's not a very good perspective for platforming. Later games were less demanding on precision, but Crash 1 goes all in with what would be manageable, albeit uninspired designs in a traditional side-scroller. It just makes them way more frustrating than it needs to be. Naughty Dog are responsible for some of the industry's best, but Crash 1 is one of the few instances where they didn't quite get it right. But what do you think of Crash 1? Let us know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe to GameXplain for more from under the Super Scope and other things gaming too. Until next time, bye!